So we're continuing to look through the book of Acts. And relative to the Bible, I think the passages we've been reading have been a little, again, relative to the Bible, have been action-packed. You know, there's been conversions, there's been confrontations. And then we get to this passage. And if you're an average person, you got to read this passage and think, boring. I mean, this is really not that interesting. Relatives are just boring. I mean, unless you're like me and you want to have theological debates. But here we have these old guys getting together in Jerusalem, and they launch into this big theological debate on circumcision or no circumcision. And again, if you're an average person, you got to be asking the question, what does this have anything to do with me today? What is it? This is such a boring debate that they're having. Okay, so I'm going to try to make it not so boring. I'm going to try to apply it to us today because it's incredibly important. This passage, actually, Acts 15, is what they call the hinge of the book of Acts. It's where things turn. After this point, Peter kind of goes off into the shadows, and Paul becomes even more prominent than he is before. This is an incredibly rich and incredibly important passage in the Bible. And we know this for about two reasons. First, if the decision that they made in this chapter to not force people to be circumcised and follow the law of Moses, who were new converts to Christianity, if that decision had gone the other way, do you realize what that means for you and me today? You wouldn't have been able to take the metro or the subway to church. You wouldn't have been able to drive your car, and I know a lot of you have long commutes to get here. You would have had to walk to get here, and coffee and donuts afterwards, forget about it. That would have been outlawed after the service. So no more coffee and donuts, no public transportation to get here. You got to walk. And circumcision? I mean, really? I heard a pastor say that if this decision had gone the other way, every new member class at church would be composed of just women and children. Because the men would be saying, you know what, that membership requirement, I don't know about that. Surgery? Honey, you go to church, I'll just stay away. Do you realize that if this decision had gone the other way, how impactful how it would have impacted your and my life in such great ways to force us to follow the law. But there's another reason why we know this is important. Because of Paul. You notice that it says Paul and Barnabas packed up their stuff. Let me give you a little context here. Paul is been doing ministry for probably about 3 years now. He's been extremely successful. He is, as much as you can be in the first century AD, he is a rock star. He really is. He's going around planting churches, getting converts. Thousands of people are saying, you know what? Paul is the one who converted me. I followed Paul. Paul's the one who taught the gospel to me. Let me put this in perspective. If 2,000 years from now, people are talking about things you wrote or said, then it means that you're pretty important. Paul is vastly popular, vastly successful. But at the minute that this issue comes up in Jerusalem, circumcision and the law, or no circumcision, no law, the minute that it comes up, Paul says, you know what, I've got to go. He packs up his stuff with Barnabas and they go off. This is profound that somebody at the height of their career would find time to go to have this boring theological debate because it's just that important. Now, I'm going to try to make this applicable to you because I know I'm talking Paul and Barnabas 2,000 years ago, Jerusalem. Doesn't seem like it has anything to do with you and me here. Let me give you an example from my life, the way that this, maybe I can capture the scope of what Paul is doing here and how important this is for him. You've heard me tell you that as a child I had a rather large head and a rather skinny body. It was very disproportionate. I've talked at length up to you about this. And it resembled something like a human Q-tip. And because of that reason, I was not good at athletics. Surprise, surprise. I could barely hold my head up. It was always kind of falling one side or the other. Now, really wasn't good at athletics. And so when I was a child in Texas, elementary school, recess was a curse. I hated recess. I had to pick something to do. I couldn't do tetherball because I was too uncoordinated. So I looked around and I tried to find something that I could do. and I found Foursquare. You guys know this, right? Foursquare. Okay, so it's just 4 squares, literally, and there's all types of variations on the game that you can play. Some of them involve numbering systems, and some of them just involve throwing the ball at a kid and seeing if you can hit him or if he can jump out of the way. So I picked Foursquare because I figure it's a rather stationary sport. I can play this, right? And also, in my playground, in the hot Texas heat, Foursquare was the only game that was in the shade. It was actually shaded by a tree. So I figured I'll get the best of both worlds. I won't pass out from sunstroke, and maybe I can make it to this game. So I remember this so clearly. I went up and I said, okay, I'm going to play Foursquare at recess. I get in there. The ball's bouncing around, the kid's my age. And all of a sudden, they're doing some like numbering system. So you have to multiply numbers or add numbers, and then you can catch the ball, throw it away. So the ball comes to me, and as it comes to me, I'm too busy thinking about this number, what have I got to come up with? So the ball slips through my hands. And the look on my friend, or they weren't even my friends, the look on my acquaintance faces would have made you think that I like dropped a baby or something. They looked at me like I had horns going out of my head. And so I said, what do they do? Little kids, they kick you out of the game. One mess up. Are you feeling sympathetic for me now, a little bit? I'm trying to engender some of that, a little bit. Sympathy has nothing to do with this story, but I'll get there. Now, the next day I came back and I said, can I play Foursquare? And of course they said, yes, you can, but you have to wait your turn. I said, okay, fine. So I stood in line and waited, and the bell went off and everything. We had to go back inside. Came back the next day, same thing. I said, can I play Foursquare today? And they said, yes, but. So I said, okay, fine, I'll wait. Waited. This happened for probably about a week or so. I finally went home, complained about it to my big brother, who was 2 years older than me, but you know when you're in elementary school, 2 years is like a lifetime. And my brother played with the big kids, which means he played on the other playground, on the other side of the school, all the way on the other side of that school. And I still remember, I'm so proud of him to this day still. I came in and I said, guys, can I play Foursquare? And they said, yes, you can, but there's a condition. And I said, I know. Well, my brother got word of that after I complained about it, and he marched over with his friends. Now, how cool is this? He marched over with his friends and he said, you know what? There will be no but. Let him play. Let him play. And of course, because he was the big kid, they let me play. Now, why do I tell you that stupid story? Because this is what Paul's doing. It's a playground. And he's going to the big kids. Or he's going to the small kids. He's one of the big kids. Paul and Barnabas, James and Peter, they're going on the playground and they're saying, no buts, no conditions. Let them play. Let these people called the Gentiles in without any conditions. And what they do is they give us the clearest picture of the gospel message and what it can do for you and me in our lives. And they say, no more buts, no more conditions. Let them in. Let them in. And when Paul and Barnabas and Peter and James explain the gospel, what we see are two things. We see the amazing liberty of this gospel message. The amazing liberty. The no more buts, the no more conditions. We see this liberty of the gospel, but we also see a community of the gospel. It's in this passage. Let's dive into it. What do I mean first by liberty? Oh, sweet, sweet liberty. Here's some context. These Pharisaical Christians, they're Christians, by the way. They're converts. And Pharisees, you know, always like to follow the rules. They're all about the rules. These Pharisaical Christians are standing up and saying this. These new Christians who are Gentiles, they must follow the same laws that we have our entire life. And I'll give you a scope. There are 613 laws. 248 were positive, 365 were negative. 365 don'ts. Could you imagine somebody coming in and telling you, don't touch that, don't touch that, don't talk to them, don't eat that food. Rule after rule after rule. These Pharisaical Christians said these new converts have to follow the same laws we did. 613. And in verse 5, basically the translation could be this. We've done it, now they have to do it. We are pretty good people, they would be saying. We followed the laws. We're respectable. We're good people. Now, they need to do the same thing. We've done it our whole lives. Now it's their turn. They can come into the church, but they can play the four-square game, but there's a condition. Now, let me take it from 2,000 years ago to today, and I'm going to do a little exercise with you. You can close your eyes if you want to, if it helps you imagine this. What I want you to do is imagine the last person that greatly upset you. And if you're married, your spouse doesn't count. You got to think of somebody else. I know, that's an easy one. I want you to think of the last person. I want you to literally put them in your head. Have a picture of the last person that either completely embarrassed you, completely wronged you, completely betrayed you, or completely made you mad. You got it? And if you don't have somebody in your head, then you're just too good of a person. We all get mad. Imagine that. Now, as you have that person in your head, what I want you to do is imagine that person walking through the doors here, these little glass doors. And I want you to imagine that person coming in, keep them in your head, sitting down right next to you. Now, hopefully this is getting a little awkward for you. Okay, maybe they pull out their Bible and they start singing the songs, and they sit right next to you. Now I'm going to carry it even further. After service, they walk right with you to the coffee and donuts area, and they reach for a donut just as you reach for a donut. Now you get what I'm getting at here. How awkward would that be? If that person walked through the door, whoever that is in your head, the last person to anger you, to ridicule you, to embarrass you, would you surely not get up and go sit somewhere else if they sat right next to you? Or would you surely not say, what are they doing here? The reason why I did that exercise is to show the point that we place conditions on everyone around us, including ourselves, for acceptance. The title of the sermon is Embraced. And if that person who wronged you, that person who offended you in every way came in the door, you surely, if you're human and honest with yourself, would say, they don't belong here. I've worked hard. Get them out of here. Or at the very least, you probably wouldn't even talk to them. You would ignore them. See, in our lives, and this is what Paul knew, this is what Peter knew, there's always going to be people who are trying to put conditions for acceptance, conditions for embrace. What conditions do you place on others for you to accept them? See, that's really what's going on here in the early church. These people were placing conditions. They were saying, yes, they can come in, but first. And Peter and James and Paul and Barnabas say there is no but first. There is only grace. All of our lives, your jobs, your school, there's always conditions. And if you fail those conditions, you fail at that pursuit. Paul and Barnabas, Peter and James, and these guys know that with God there are no conditions. And the gospel tells us this. The good news is that Jesus Christ says, what I've done for you means there are no conditions that you must meet now. But if you continue to follow the conditions of your heart, you'll never live up to them. There'll always be a burden for you. And in verse 10, he says yoke. Remember, look back at verse 10, he says, why are we going to put a yoke on them like we've had on ourselves? We can't even bear this. What is a yoke? A yoke is to put on animals, to keep them together and to keep them going in a straight line, because by and large, agricultural animals like cows and oxen are stupid. And they have this heavy burden on them to drive them one way and to drive them into work and to drive them and drive them. Paul, Barnabas, Peter, and James, these guys know that if you and I put conditions on ourselves for God to accept us, or if we put conditions on other people for us to accept them, that's a yoke and it's too heavy to bear. I know, okay. Grace is a typical concept. And whenever I get stuck on something, and I know I've just been talking for a while, and you're like, what's the point? Okay, liberty, what does that mean? Let me give you an illustration. Because whenever I get to this liberty of the gospel, it's such like a pie-in-the-sky, cloudy notion that it's hard to bring down to bear. Whenever I have that problem, I go to children's books. Don't judge. I know you guys read all these intelligent books and everything. I go to children's books, and there's one in particular that captures this, and it's Ella Enchanted. I don't know if you guys know this one. I didn't read it as a kid. I read it a few years ago. It came out in 1997. There was a movie made. Don't worry about that. Let's focus on the text. Always better than the movie for the most part. Ella Enchanted. Ella, it's a modern-day remake of Cinderella. And with a little twist. Ella, this little girl, is visited by a fairy. And the fairy Lucinda gives her what she considers a gift, but it ends up being a curse. She tells Ella, you have to follow every rule that other people make on you. You can never say no. So when anybody's ever asked you to do something, you have to do it. And of course, the fairy thinks that's a gift for some reason. Ella thinks it's a curse. Because why? Whenever people find out, they start taking advantage of this. They start saying, okay, now do this. And there's one point in the story where her friend says, wait a second, you have to do whatever I tell you to? And she says, yes. She says, okay, let's race, and I want you to lose. And so Ella says, oh, I don't want to do it. Okay, but I can't say no. So she has to. Her entire life is a series of people taking control of her and saying, you do this, you do this. And she has two evil or mean stepsisters, Olive and Hattie, and they take advantage of this too. They boss her around. She gets bossed around at school. Now, Ella's got a cook in their house named Mandy. And Mandy, to the best of her ability, keeps Ella in the kitchen, and she bosses Ella around, saying, come here, taste this. Go get me the salt. Go get me these crackers. And Ella thinks this is just, she hates it. She says, why do I have to be bossed around so much? Why are you doing this to me, Mandy? Mandy, why are you being so bossy? And it appears that Mandy's mean. In the middle of the book, you find out that Mandy, all along, was Ella's fairy godmother. And she explains to her, the reason why I kept you in the kitchen is because I didn't want you out in the world where people were going to burden you and take advantage of you. See, Mandy gave her orders, and Ella had to accept them, but the orders to taste a soup were so much sweeter than the orders that Olive or Hattie would give to Ella. Ella had the curse and to be burdened by the commands and the conditions of everyone around her. And yet it's Mandy who says, if you have my conditions, though they appear to you at first to be burdensome, they are so less burdensome than all the other commands and conditions that other people will place on you, little Ella. And there's a beautiful part in the story where Ella comes home from school and she's just been beaten down by everybody, bossing her around and telling her to do this and telling her to do this. The first thing she does is she runs into the kitchen. She sees Mandy making soup, and Mandy turns to her and squeezes her. And Ella says, I wish she'd never stop squeezing me. I wish I could spend the rest of my life as a child being slightly crushed by someone who loved me. The gospel says this, Jesus Christ, though you think coming under him is a command and a burden, it's like being slightly crushed by someone you love. But if you don't come underneath him and his condition, if you don't come under his grace, you and I will be beaten down by the yoke and the burden of every other condition that other people place on us for acceptance. We'll feel never good enough. We'll feel like we don't have joy in our life. See, that's the liberty, to be an Ella. The liberty of the gospel says, run to Jesus so he can slightly crush you with his love, rather than you be immensely crushed by the conditions and terms of the world around you, to measure up to their conditions. You never will. But Jesus says, you need not measure up to mine. Here's grace. Let me squeeze you. But lastly, I wanted to spend more time on this, but for time's sake, we don't have that much. The community. There's the liberty. Okay, you're free. Grace frees you. 613 laws, get them out of here. You have grace. We have grace. But we also have community. Do you notice that when this issue comes up, circumcision or no circumcision, Paul does not take his book to Starbucks, put on his headphones, and think about the issue to himself and ponder it. Paul doesn't go and have a latte and say, let me think about this by myself for a while. No. Paul and Barnabas, Peter and James, it says they get together in the assembly. See the importance of this? For you and I to work out such a complex idea of grace and the gospel, we have to do it together. Together. And this is why next month I'm going to do a little plug here. Next month, we'll be starting our small groups. And this is what small groups and home fellowship groups are for, to work out the gospel. This was a major issue. These guys didn't know the answer to it, but they said, in community, we will find this answer. And only in community. And just a quick note before I close here. Verse 19 and 20, I know you're probably going, wait a second, but they did give them rules at the end. They didn't give them the 613, but they gave them about 4 at the end. What's up? What's going on with that? What's up with that? Here, what I'll tell you, I'll summarize it this way. And almost every commentator you read is going to say the same thing. These rules that they give them at the end, don't eat strangled things, don't avoid the blood, sexual immorality. What they're saying to the Gentiles are, listen, do you not realize that your Jewish brothers and sisters, they've worked really hard to keep these laws, and they have certain cultural practices. Can you try to get along with them? It's sort of a can't we all get along thing. That's the summary of it. If you want to talk the theology of it, we can do that. They make these rules not as because they just said no rules, no circumcision, no 613 laws. Why now would they give them 4? It's because they're doing it to bond the community. They're saying, if you do these things, you can then eat together at the table of fellowship. But lastly, and I know this is where it's going to get a little PG-13, a little bit. Luca, cover your ears. I got to address this issue of circumcision. I got to do it because it's, a lot of people look at the Bible, they approach it and they go, why circumcision? Why this? This is archaic. It's bloody. It's gross. It's intimately vulnerable. It's painful. Why is this the covenant sign between God and his people? And why this would be the thing that people emphasize to show that you're in that covenant? Here. Circumcision, yes, it's painful, it's bloody, it's intimately vulnerable. It was a symbol. And you've heard me probably talk about this a little bit before. In the Old Testament, when you made a contract or a covenant with someone, you didn't sign a piece of paper necessarily. Now, thousands of years from now, people are going to look back at you and me and say, those silly people signing pieces of paper for contracts. Oh, how outdated. Now, we look back at them and say, oh, this is outdated, but you know the way that they signed contracts? Do you know the way that they signed covenants? It always came through blood. And it came through sacrificing an animal, and what it was is a symbol to say this, if I break my covenant with you, then let this be done to me. If you made a covenant promise to a king, you sacrificed an animal as the way to say, if I break my promise to you, O king, let this be done to you, or to me. This is why circumcision came into play as a covenant between God and his people, because it was a way to be cut off. And in Colossians 2:11, Paul writes that you and I now are circumcised by Christ. What does that mean? It means that he was cut off for us. It means that he was bloodied on the cross for us. It means that he felt extreme pain and torment for us. Do you see this? Christ was cut off on the cross so that you and I don't have to be, that you and I will not be. No conditions. No more blood. No more covenant promises where animals are sacrificed, because Jesus was the sacrifice. And he made it right. You and I have a choice, to be quite honest. You're going to go to work tomorrow. You're going to go to school. You're going to be at home with your family and relationships. Here's your choice. Do you want a yoke? Do you want to constantly have to live up to the conditions and the terms that the world sets, that other people set for you, or that even you set for yourself? Or can you say, I want this grace? I know that it was Jesus who was cut off. And because he was cut off, I'm brought in to community, to liberty. Oh, that we could all be Ella. I wish I'd never stop being a child, to be slightly crushed by someone who loves me. Jesus says, I was crushed fully so that you can come into my embrace. No conditions, just grace. Please pray with me.